The lecture hall was packed. Nearly 1,000 students, most of them fresh-faced undergraduates, sat on the edges of their seats, eagerly waiting for the entrance of the man whose legend had been whispered through the corridors of the university long before they even stepped foot on campus. Professor Demetrius Ezekiel was not just a lecturer, he was an institution. The man who had been celebrated across Africa for his unparalleled mastery of English and linguistics. The scholar who had humbled foreign professors in international debates and whose books were used as reference materials in universities worldwide. Then, the moment arrived. The back doors swung open, and there he was. Professor Demetrius stepped in, dressed in his signature white kaftan and red cap, his thick glasses balanced perfectly on his nose. His presence commanded instant silence. Even the notorious backbenchers sat up. Without preamble, he lifted the chalk and wrote on the board. But as he took a step back, a collective gasp rippled through the hall. He had written his own name wrong. Professor Dismiter Ezekiel. The students blinked. A murmur of confusion spread across the room. The great Professor Demetrius, the man who had written award-winning books on phonetics and orthography, had misspelled his own name? Professor Demetrius himself frowned at the board, his face twisted in slight confusion. He chuckled nervously. Well, what do we have here? He tried to laugh it off, but when he attempted to erase the mistake, he hesitated, staring at the letters as if they were foreign hieroglyphs. Then he turned to the class and asked in a small, uncertain voice, "How do you spell Demetrius again?" A pin-drop silence followed. A few students exchanged wide-eyed glances, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Was this a joke? Was he testing them? Then, as if on cue, someone in the front row let out a nervous giggle. A giggle that quickly spread across the room, rolling into full-blown laughter. The great professor, known for his linguistic precision, was pretending to forget how to spell his own name? It had to be a prank. But when Professor Demetrius turned to the class, his face was pale. His eyes, usually sharp and filled with scholarly authority, now held something else. Confusion. Fear. Helplessness. A bead of sweat trickled down his forehead. He dropped the chalk, staring at his own fingers as though they belonged to someone else. His breathing became shallow, his chest rising and falling in irregular spurts. Then, without warning, his legs buckled. And before anyone could react, the most brilliant professor in the history of the university collapsed onto the cold, hard floor. Screams erupted. Students rushed forward. Phones were pulled out. Some recorded. Some dialed emergency numbers. But amidst the chaos, one question burned in every mind. What just happened to Professor Demetrius? Please subscribe. The ambulance raced through the busy streets of the university town, sirens wailing as paramedics fought to stabilize the unconscious professor. Within the walls of the university, shockwaves spread like wildfire. WhatsApp groups exploded with frantic messages. Did you hear? Prof collapsed in class. I was there. He forgot how to spell his own name. No way. The great Demetrius? Impossible. At the administrative block, the vice-chancellor, Professor Isaac, nearly dropped his cup of coffee when the news reached him. Demetrius? Our Demetrius, he bellowed, slamming his hand on his desk. Yes, sir, the shaken dean of faculty stammered. He had some kind of episode in class. The student said he couldn't even spell his name. Then he collapsed. A heavy silence settled in the office. Professor Isaac took a deep breath and stood up. Summon the university medical board. I want answers. Now. But the answers wouldn't come easily. Because what had happened to Professor Demetrius was not a mere case of stress. It was something far worse. Something no one, not the students, not the faculty, not even the finest doctors, would see coming. Professor Demetrius Ezekiel woke up to the steady beep-beep of a heart monitor. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing a dimly lit hospital room. A ceiling fan spun lazily above him, casting slow-moving shadows on the white walls. The sterile scent of disinfectant filled the air. His head throbbed. He blinked, struggling to focus. A woman sat beside his bed, her hands clasped together, her face tense with worry. Her eyes lit up with hope when she saw him stir. Demetrius, you're awake. He turned his head slowly, squinting at her. The woman, middle-aged, dressed in a modest Ankara gown, reached for his hand. He flinched slightly at her touch. She noticed. A shadow crossed her face. Demetrius, it's me. Ebony. Your wife. He swallowed. The name sounded familiar, yet distant, like an old song whose lyrics he couldn't quite remember. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. A nurse hurried in, followed closely by a man in a suit, Vice-Chancellor Isaac. Please subscribe. Professor Demetrius, how do you feel? The VC asked, his tone professional but laced with deep concern. Demetrius tried to answer. He wanted to answer. But as he opened his mouth, the words wouldn't come out right. Not feel good. A stunned silence. His wife gasped. The nurse's pen froze midair. The VC's face hardened. Professor Demetrius, the man who had lectured on phonology and semantics for over 20 years, was now struggling to string together a single coherent sentence. The news spread like wildfire. Professor Demetrius is sick. No, he's not just sick, he can't talk properly. How is that possible? This is the man who corrected a BBC journalist's pronunciation on live TV. The students who had laughed in his classroom just hours earlier were now quiet, unsettled by the reality of the situation. At the faculty office, whispers turned into frantic discussions. Could it be a stroke? Maybe he's just exhausted. He's been overworking himself. Or, could someone have done this to him? The last suggestion made a few people shift uneasily. This was Africa. Stories of spiritual attacks were not uncommon. Could someone, perhaps an envious colleague or rival, have cast a curse on the brilliant professor? The university authorities dismissed such thoughts. Instead, they ordered the best neurologists in the country to examine him. But every scan, every test, came back with the same baffling result. There is no significant damage to his brain. No tumor, no stroke, no degenerative disease. Yet, he couldn't spell his own name. Days passed. Then weeks. Professor Demetrius's condition worsened. He could walk. He could eat. But words, the very thing that had built his legacy, betrayed him. Simple sentences became an uphill battle. Pass me that thing that, you know. His frustration grew. Sometimes, he threw things in anger. Other times, he sat silently for hours, staring at the wall. His students stopped laughing. Instead, they wept. One afternoon, a young girl from his 100-level class, overwhelmed with emotion, knelt beside his hospital bed and sobbed. "Sir, please come back to us. Please." The sight of her tears cracked something inside him. He tried to comfort her. "I will try to remember." But even as he said it, a chilling thought crossed his mind. What if I never recover? Please subscribe. Ebony sat at the edge of her bed, her hands shaking as she held the phone to her ear. "Doctor, tell me the truth, is there any hope?" The neurologist sighed on the other end. "Mrs. Ebony, your husband's condition is rare. His memory isn't entirely gone, it's just fragmented. It's as if a part of his brain refuses to connect to the rest. What can we do?" There was a long pause. "There's a surgical procedure that might work. But it's risky. It involves precise brain stimulation to reawaken the affected neural pathways. If it fails, he could lose even more of his memory. Or worse." Ebony squeezed her eyes shut. "If we do nothing, will he ever get better?" The doctor hesitated. "Unlikely." Ebony felt a lump rise in her throat. She had one choice. One desperate, terrifying choice. Would she take the risk and let the surgeons attempt to save the man she loved? Or would she watch him fade away, piece by piece, until he was nothing more than a shell of himself? The night before the surgery, the hospital room was silent except for the occasional beep of the monitor. The air was thick with unspoken words, but neither Ebony nor Demetrius knew how to begin. She sat beside him, holding his hand, running her thumb over his fingers. For years, those hands had held books, written essays, and shaped the minds of thousands of students. Now, they trembled slightly, as though aware of the uncertainty that lay ahead. "Demetrius," she whispered. He turned to her, his eyes reflecting a flicker of recognition. "The doctors say, tomorrow, will be," she choked on the words. "The big thing," he tried to say. She nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes. The big thing." A shadow of the man she had known for decades flashed in his eyes. He studied her face, as if memorizing every feature, then lifted a trembling hand and touched her cheek. "You scared?" Her lips quivered. "Not as much as you are." He tried to smile but failed. Then, after a long pause, he whispered something so softly that she barely caught it. "If I not come back." Ebony pressed a trembling finger to his lips. "Don't say that. You will come back to me." A tear slipped down her cheek and landed on his hand. That night, as she sat by his bedside, watching his chest rise and fall, she held on to one thought desperately. Tomorrow, everything must change. Please subscribe. The operating theater was a flurry of movement. Machines beeped. The faint smell of sterilization filled the air. Professor Demetrius lay unconscious on the table, his head partially shaved, the bright surgical light illuminating his face. "Are we ready?" Dr. Kalu, the lead neurosurgeon, asked, adjusting his gloves. His team nodded. The procedure they were about to perform was rare. They would insert microelectrodes into the affected region of the professor's brain, stimulating neural pathways that had been damaged by his accident. A single mistake could destroy his cognitive abilities permanently. The room grew tense as Dr. Kalu made the first incision. Outside the hospital, hundreds of students and staff gathered, holding candles, praying, hoping. The vice-chancellor himself paced the waiting area, his fingers steepled in front of his face. Minutes turned into hours. The students held their breath. Then, deep within the operating room, something unexpected happened. As the electrodes fired impulses into Professor Demetrius's brain, his fingers twitched. His lips moved slightly. And then, in a faint but unmistakable voice, he murmured, "My name is Demetrius Ezekiel." The world seemed to stop. The doctors froze. The nurses exchanged glances. Dr. Kalu leaned in, his heart pounding. "Demetrius? Can you hear me?" For a long, breathless moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, Professor Demetrius's eyes fluttered open. He blinked at the harsh surgical lights, his mind slowly adjusting. He turned his head slightly, scanning the room. His gaze fell on Dr. Kalu. "Yes," he said, his voice hoarse but unmistakably clear. "I can hear you." The medical team erupted into motion. Vital signs were checked. Neurological responses were tested. Every moment was documented. But the only thing that mattered was the look in the professor's eyes. It was back. That sharp, brilliant light that had been missing for so long. "Professor," Dr. Kalu asked carefully, "can you spell your name for me?" Demetrius frowned slightly, as if insulted by the question. Then, with a clarity that sent shivers down everyone's spine, he said, "Demetrius Ezekiel." A stunned silence filled the room. And then, cheers. The doctors cheered. The nurses clapped. One even wiped away tears. After months of despair, the greatest professor of English and linguistics had returned. And outside the hospital, when the news reached the waiting crowd, a deafening roar of joy exploded into the night. Please subscribe. The vice-chancellor received the news while pacing in the waiting room. When the nurse burst through the doors, breathless, with a bright smile, he nearly tripped over himself. "He's awake," she cried. "He's speaking." For a moment, the VC forgot his age, his title, everything. He rushed forward and grabbed her shoulders. "What did he say?" "He spelled his name. Perfectly." Professor Isaac staggered back, overwhelmed. He turned toward the mass of students waiting outside and, with tears in his eyes, raised his hands. "He's back," he shouted. "Professor Demetrius is back." The eruption of joy that followed could have shaken the very foundations of the university. Students hugged. Lecturers wiped their eyes. Some fell to their knees in thanksgiving. Inside the hospital, Professor Demetrius sat up in bed, bewildered by the sudden commotion outside. He turned to Ebony, who was sobbing beside him. He frowned. "Why are you crying?" She let out a choked laugh. "You wouldn't understand. Not yet." He touched her face again, then looked at the nurse. "Where am I?" "You're in the university hospital, sir," she answered. He blinked. His gaze sharpened. "The university," he murmured. "That means, my students. They've been waiting for you, sir," the nurse said softly. "They never gave up on you." For the first time in months, the great professor let out a deep, relieved sigh. Then, with a small smile, he said, "Well, I suppose I owe them a lecture." The news of Professor Demetrius's recovery spread across the university like wildfire. By the time he was discharged from the hospital, the campus had transformed into a festival ground. Students lined the roads leading to the Faculty of Arts, waving banners, chanting his name, and singing victory songs. Some had even printed T-shirts with his face and the words, "Welcome back, Professor." It was an overwhelming sight. As the university's official car pulled up in front of the lecture hall, a deafening cheer erupted. Professor Demetrius, now clad in his signature three-piece suit, stepped out of the car and adjusted his glasses. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking at the faces of his students, his colleagues, and even the school cleaners who had paused their work just to see him return. Then, he smiled. The students went wild. "Professor," they chanted. "Professor! Professor!" The vice-chancellor himself led the welcome procession. "Professor Demetrius," he said with emotion in his voice, "the university is honored to have you back." Demetrius placed a hand over his heart. "And I am honored to be back." His eyes swept over the massive crowd. "Shall we go to class?" he asked with a grin. Another deafening cheer followed. He had returned. And now, he would prove that he was still the professor they had always known. Please subscribe. The largest lecture hall on campus, designed to accommodate 1,000 students, was overflowing. Not just the 100-level students but seniors, alumni, and even lecturers had squeezed into every available space to witness his first class after his ordeal. Demetrius stood at the podium, gazing at the sea of expectant faces. His heart pounded, not out of fear, but anticipation. With a slow, deliberate movement, he picked up the white chalk and turned to the blackboard. The hall fell silent. He wrote his name in bold letters. Prof. Demetrius Ezekiel. Then he turned back to face the class. As you can see, he said, I can now spell my name. Laughter rippled through the hall. But, he continued, I have learned something far more important than spelling in these past few months. The hall grew silent again. I have learned, he said, that a man is not his intelligence alone. A man is his community. Without the love, support, and prayers of the people in this university, I might have remained lost forever. Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. Some students wiped their eyes. He cleared his throat. And now, let us begin. Who can define the term lexicology? Hands shot up instantly. Professor Demetrius chuckled. Ah, it feels good to be back. For weeks after his return, Professor Demetrius was his usual brilliant self. He taught with passion, held intellectual debates, and even took on extra mentoring sessions for struggling students. But something was off. A feeling gnawed at him in the quiet moments, an emptiness he couldn't quite explain. One evening, as he sat in his study at home, he flipped through his old research notes. The handwriting was his, the ideas familiar, but they felt distant. Like reading the thoughts of a stranger. Ebony found him staring at a piece of paper, deep in thought. You look troubled, she said. He sighed. Ebony. I remember everything. My work, my students, my past. But I feel like I've lost something. Something important. She sat beside him and took his hand. Maybe it's not something. Maybe it's someone. He frowned. What do you mean? She hesitated, then softly said, Do you remember? Jesleen? The room fell silent. His brow furrowed. Jesleen? Who is? He stopped mid-sentence, his fingers trembling over the paper. And then, like a missing puzzle piece snapping into place, a flood of memories hit him. Jesleen had been his protégé. His brightest student. The young woman who had once vowed to surpass him in the field of linguistics. She had been like a daughter to him. But then, his accident. And somewhere along the way, she had vanished from his mind completely. He turned to Ebony, panic in his eyes. Where is she? Ebony hesitated. She left the university, Demetrius. She thought you had forgotten her. His breath caught in his throat. I need to find her, he whispered. Ebony nodded. Then let's go. Professor Demetrius wasted no time. The moment he realized Jesleen had left the university, an urgency filled his bones. He needed to see her. He needed to explain. He spent the entire night combing through old emails, research papers, and attendance sheets, anything that might hold a clue to where she had gone. Finally, he found something. A last recorded address. Without hesitation, he grabbed his car keys. Ebony stood at the doorway, worry in her eyes. Are you sure you should go alone? He nodded. This is something I need to do myself. With that, he drove into the night, chasing the ghost of a memory he had lost. Please subscribe. Jesleen now lived in a quiet town on the outskirts of the city. When Demetrius arrived at the small apartment complex, his heart pounded. Would she recognize him? Would she even want to see him? He knocked. A moment passed. Then, the door creaked open. And there she was. Jesleen. But she was different. The once vibrant, brilliant young woman who had filled his lectures with challenging questions and fierce debates now looked tired. Defeated. Her eyes widened in shock. Professor? Demetrius's voice caught in his throat. Jesleen. I? But before he could finish, she slammed the door shut. Demetrius stood frozen. Then, from behind the closed door, he heard muffled sobs. His heart shattered. He knocked again, softly this time. Jesleen, please. A few minutes passed before the door opened just enough for her to peek out. Her face was streaked with tears. Why are you here, Professor? Her voice was hoarse. Demetrius swallowed the lump in his throat. Because I finally remember. She let out a bitter laugh. You remember? Do you know what it was like, coming to the hospital to see you, only for you to look at me like I was a stranger? Do you know how many times I waited for you to call my name in class, only to realize that you had erased me from your mind? Her voice cracked. You were my mentor, my role model. And I was nothing to you. Demetrius felt the weight of her words like a physical blow. I didn't erase you, Jesleen. I lost myself. Silence stretched between them. Then, he whispered, let me fix this. Jesleen stared at him for a long moment. Then, with a trembling sigh, she stepped aside. Come in. Please subscribe. Jaslene's apartment was modest, filled with books and research notes scattered across the room. But there was something else. A thick layer of dust covered some of the books. Demetrius noticed the unopened letters from the university. The half-written research proposals. The unfinished dreams. She had given up. And it was because of him. They sat in silence for a while before Jasleen finally spoke. "I left because I couldn't stay where I wasn't seen," she said. "You were everything I aspired to be. When you forgot me, it felt like I never existed." Demetrius took a deep breath. "I failed you, Jasleen." She looked at him, surprised by his honesty. "You didn't deserve what happened," he continued. "But if you'll let me, I want to make it right." Jasleen hesitated. "How?" He smiled softly. "Come back." Her eyes widened. "To the university?" "Yes. To your dreams. To your passion. I won't let you fade away again." Tears welled up in her eyes. And for the first time in a long time, hope flickered in them. 2 weeks later, the university was in for another surprise. The legendary Professor Demetrius had returned to his full glory. But that wasn't the biggest shock. The day he walked into the lecture hall, Jasleen was beside him. Gasps filled the room. Some students remembered her. Others only knew the rumors, the mysterious student who had disappeared after the professor's accident. Demetrius cleared his throat. "Today," he announced, "we welcome back one of the brightest minds in this institution. She is not just my student, she is my legacy." The hall erupted in applause. Jasleen's eyes glistened as she took her seat in the front row, just like she always had. She was home. And so was he. Despite his full recovery, one fear remained. Would his mind betray him again? One evening, as he sat grading papers, he hesitated. He picked up a pen and, with trembling hands, wrote his name on a sheet of paper. Professor Demetrius Ezekiel. He stared at it. Perfect. Then, he turned to an old research project. The one he had abandoned after his accident. With a steady hand, he wrote the first sentence. And just like that, the final piece of himself fell into place. Months passed. The hall erupted in applause. Jasleen's eyes glistened as she took her seat in the front row, just like she always had. She was home. And so was he. Despite his full recovery, one fear remained. Would his mind betray him again? One evening, as he sat grading papers, he hesitated. He picked up a pen and, with trembling hands, wrote his name on a sheet of paper. Professor Demetrius Ezekiel. He stared at it. Perfect. Then, he turned to an old research project. The one he had abandoned after his accident. With a steady hand, he wrote the first sentence. And just like that, the final piece of himself fell into place. Months passed. The university flourished. Professor Demetrius was back to mentoring students, giving public lectures, and publishing groundbreaking research. But this time, he wasn't alone. Jasleen, now a graduate assistant, stood beside him, ready to carry the torch. At a prestigious international conference, the university's name echoed through the halls. A presenter stepped forward and announced, "And now, we invite Professor Demetrius Ezekiel and his research partner, Miss Jasleen Brown, to the stage." A standing ovation followed. As Demetrius took the microphone, he looked at Jasleen and smiled. He had nearly lost everything. But in the end, he had gained something even greater. A second chance. A legacy reborn. And a future that would never be forgotten. Please subscribe.